Last week I spent a lot of time, more time than my usual sermons, to explain how radiometric dating, like carbon dating, just doesn't work and is not even close to being a reliable way of measuring how old something is. I explained how it supposedly works and how it has too many assumptions built in. And I showed a whole bunch of examples of wrong test results that prove that the results they get are not empirical science. I also gave you a bunch of quotes from people who admit that they cherry pick the dates that they get published in textbooks and throw out all the dates that don't fit within their desired beliefs. So how else does modern science measure the age of something? What other empirical methods do they use to determine how old something is? We've all been taught that coal and diamonds and oil and dinosaurs and a whole bunch of other things are millions of years old, right? But how do they know that? Do they know that? If carbon dating doesn't really work, which it doesn't, then what else do they have to prove that these things are millions of years old? Believe it or not, they've got nothing. Every single time they claim something is millions of years old, it's based completely on false assumptions. I'm going to focus now on a whole bunch of reasons why the belief in millions of or billions of years is not only unnecessary, it's flat out impossible. One of the biggest things that tricks people into believing in millions of years is the concept of petrification. We were all told that it takes millions of years for something to become petrified, right? Well, that's just not true at all. I have a video called Creation Evidence number 25, Petrification, that shows you 5 full minutes of stuff that is obviously not millions of years old, yet it's petrified. You should really just watch that video, but I'll itemize now the more convincing things that it shows pictures of. There's a petrified water wheel that turned to stone in less than 65 years. They know when it was built, and humans weren't building technology like this millions of years ago. How could something built by modern man become petrified if it takes many millions of years for petrification to happen? Keep that in mind as I go through the rest of these. A piece of firewood was found completely petrified. It's known by the landowner that it was chopped in the 1930s, and it has chainsaw marks on each end. They didn't have chainsaws millions of years ago. And just for you skeptics out there, I looked it up. The first chainsaw was invented back in the 1800s, and the first modern chainsaw was invented in the 1920s. How does a piece of wood with chainsaw marks get petrified? How about a fishing reel found completely petrified embedded within a rock? They claim the rock is 300 million years old, but fishing reels didn't exist back then. Neither did fishermen. So how does a fishing reel become petrified and embedded within a 300 million year old rock? Maybe the rock isn't really 300 million years old. When someone chopped down a huge tree, they found that it was hollowed out and that a petrified dog was inside of it. The dog was a hunting dog back in the 1960s who was chasing a raccoon until it got stuck. In only about 20 years, the dog was preserved and petrified inside the tree. It didn't take millions of years. In 1980, someone found a cowboy boot in a dry creek bed in Texas. Still inside the boot is a human foot and partial leg, which is completely petrified. Some poor guy got his leg caught in something and lost his foot and his boot. The boot was manufactured in the early 50s. The human leg in it would have only been decades older than the boot. The petrified leg was not millions of years old. In Hawaii, someone dug up a petrified hammer in their yard. The houses were only 40 years old, and before that the land was used by a Marine camp during World War II. The hammer is probably only that old, and it petrified within 60 years. Even if the hammer is older than World War II, it's still certainly not millions of years old. In New Zealand, a bowler's hat, a modern human invention, was found completely petrified, buried underneath a volcanic eruption. The eruption happened in 1886, and they found the hat only 20 years later, and it had already turned to stone. It didn't take millions of years to petrify. It took only 20 years. In Tennessee, a family was about to bury their grandmother in a grave when they noticed water seeping into the grave. They instead buried her elsewhere. But they decided to dig up their grandfather, who had been buried there 14 years earlier. Within 14 years, his arms had rotted away, but his entire body had completely petrified. Another man was found in Montana in 1897 whose entire body was completely petrified. In Arkansas, petrified sacks of flour were found as the result of a flour mill being flooded. A man found a mason jar with the lid rusted off. Inside the jar, he found a completely petrified pickle. Mason jars are not millions of years old. A 6-year-old kid in North Carolina put a bunch of acorns in a bucket of water to see if they'd sprout, but then forgot about them. A year later, they were found on the back porch, completely petrified within a single year. There are several other examples in the video, but I'll mention this last one before moving on to something else. A teddy bear with a bow tie, an obvious modern invention of man, was found completely petrified. They certainly didn't have teddy bears or bow ties millions of years ago. Okay, now I hope all of that information helps to put enough doubt in your mind about the reliability of the scientific claims for millions of years. Nobody can empirically prove that petrification takes millions of years. I've shown you many examples proving that it certainly doesn't take millions of years. So let me now mention some things that actually suggest the opposite, that these things must be relatively young, as in only thousands of years old instead of millions. You won't hear about any of these things in your school textbooks, but they are all documented evidence in one way or another. There are such things in the world that are called out-of-place artifacts. They are actually common enough that they have been given the nickname OPART, O-O-P-A-R-T, OPART, which stands for out-of-place artifact. These are things that have been found in rock layers that are supposedly millions or billions of years old, but they are obviously man-made. Something that is obviously only thousands of years old, but they found it in something that they think is millions of years old. How is that possible? It's not. Not only do these artifacts help prove that the rocks they are found in are not millions of years old, but they also prove that ancient civilizations were not as primitive as we've been led to believe. Because of our indoctrination into Darwinistic mentality, we all think that we're super smart today and people long ago were less intelligent and more ignorant. They were just stupid cavemen back then, but we're brilliant people with cars and computers today, right? Not so fast. Now these weren't found in rock layers, but they prove my point about ancient man being more advanced than we think. In a grave in Colombia, South America, they found a little golden figurine that obviously resembles an airplane. It has big front horizontal wings, smaller back horizontal wings, a vertical tail, and a cockpit. And it's estimated to be 1,000 years old. Not convincing enough? How about another figurine of an airplane found in an Egyptian tomb from 2,100 years ago? How did an Egyptian from over 2,000 years ago come up with the idea to carve out a model that just happens to look exactly like a modern airplane? In 1912, a small cast iron pot was found buried inside the coal that they dug up from the ground. They broke open a lump of coal, and it had this iron pot inside of it. The coal was perfectly molded to the shape of the pot, so it's obvious that the coal formed around the pot. How about a brass bell with a little Hindu-looking person on the handle, found inside a lump of coal in 1944? How does coal that's supposedly millions of years old mysteriously contain something that could have only been created by man? I'll tell you how. The coal isn't millions of years old. The pot and bell were created by somebody before Noah's flood. They were dropped somewhere like in a forest or a garden. Noah's flood came along and turned the forest or garden into coal, along with the pot and bell. The Bible tells us that people worked with metal before the flood. They weren't stupid cavemen. They could do things that we still don't know how they did them today. In 1891, a woman broke open a lump of coal and found a 10-inch gold chain. In 1851, something resembling a candlestick holder made out of zinc and silver was found in solid rock that was supposedly over 600 million years old. It's obviously man-made, and this proves the rock couldn't be 600 million years old. A mortar and pestle was found in rock that's supposedly at least 33 million years old. A metallic sphere, obviously man-made, was found in a Precambrian mineral deposit supposedly 2.8 billion years old. Now, you might not know what Precambrian means. The Cambrian explosion is supposedly when the first life form started, the very bottom of the evolutionary chain, so to speak. But this man-made item was found under it. In 1934, the top part of a hammer with a broken wooden shaft through it was found inside of rock that was supposedly 400 million years old. Part of the handle had turned to coal, and the hammer itself was analyzed to be made of iron, chlorine, and sulfur. The hammer doesn't rust, and today's scientists say they can't get those three elements to combine today in today's weaker magnetic field. The hammer came from before Noah's flood, when the magnetic field of the planet was much stronger. In 100 BC, a ship sunk in the Aegean Sea. They found on board the remains of what can only be called an analog computer that calculates the movement of the sun and planets by turning a crank for the sake of navigating the ship. The History Channel did an hour-long special on it and rebuilt a working replica of it. In many places in the world, there are unexplainable things that humans obviously built. They still don't know how the Egyptian pyramids were built, although I've heard people speculate how they think they did it. But what about the stone walls, like down in Peru, that have stones in them that are so big and heavy that we couldn't possibly move them today, even with the biggest crane ever invented? These stones weigh as much as 20,000 tons. That's 40 million pounds. It's the size of a 5-story house. They didn't have industrial cranes back then, and the biggest cranes we have today can only move 3,000 to 6,000 tons, not 20,000. How did they build those walls if they were so stupid? Many skulls have been found that suggest that they were doing brain surgery. The holes in the skull were healed over, suggesting the patient lived after a successful procedure. How about this? An ancient map was found that shows Antarctica, but without any ice. How is that possible? Maybe because long ago, Antarctica wasn't covered with all that ice yet, and ancient man was able to map it out. I haven't told you everything that's in the videos. These are just some of the best examples. Watch the videos for more details. Next, I'll be getting into the empirical ways to show that the planet couldn't possibly be millions of years old. There are a lot of scientific ways to show that the Earth can only be several thousand years old.